Hello, good evening, and welcome to today's BIC stream session. And indeed, there will be time. A conversation between a poet and a dancer. This evening, poet, writer, and critic Arundhati Subramaniam and performer, choreographer, and facilitator Preethi Athreya engage in a conversation about what drives them to undertake their creative processes and how they each negotiate the role of art within society, especially given the present circumstances of the pandemic. This is the first in a series of collaborations with Prakriti Foundation. We look forward to more such interesting conversations. And while we're at this, please feel free to post any questions, comments, or observations in the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And the full bios of both the panelists will appear in the chat box. And now we can dive straight into the conversation. I'm handing it over to Arundhati.
Thank you, Lekha. And hello, everyone, whoever's logging in at this point. I just want to start by saying that this is a conversation that is one I'm looking forward to particularly because Preethi and I don't know each other very well. I've met her briefly at dance conferences and at events, but we've never really had a conversation. But from the glimpses that I've had of her work and really the faint resonances that I'm picking up, even in my current conversation with her over the past half hour, give me the sense that this will not be our last conversation. And I'm going to start by just asking you, Preethi, there are many things I'd like to talk about. For the sake of the audience, I just want to say we're going to spend the first half of this session talking about broad creative concerns, all the various ways in which we look at our practice, at our art practice, and what shapes that. But we then move into a film by Preethi, and in the second half of which actually it's a film of her most recent work, and we then move into a conversation around that film, which also has themes that resonate deeply with me. So I just want to start, Preethi, by asking you a question that you've probably been asked before, because this is a line that I found, in fact, in your own bio. And or perhaps it was in a program note, I'm not sure which. But it spoke to me because it's a line in which you talk of the quest that you've had for a very long time, the quest for the honest body. And I completely understood what that might mean for a dancer, particularly because you said the honest body free of artifice. Is it possible to reclaim that? It's an interesting question. It speaks to me, and I'd love to talk about it too. But just give me a sense of what this means to you.
Thanks, Arundhati. I've been waiting for this conversation for a long time, and like you, I've followed bits and pieces of what you've written, and more interestingly, what you've spoken. I'm glad we're starting with the honest body because I think it's long and abiding concern now, and it shows itself in from work to work in different ways. I have a solo practice and I have an ensemble practice, both of which are distinctly different in the modes that I employ to find this honest body. And this particular articulation that you're referring to, I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's got to do within the scope of a work called the Jumping Project, which is a piece for 10 performers, which I made in 2015. It was a sort of a collective creation. And before I go into the Jumping Project itself, which may not be entirely necessary, I think the honest body for me has always been how do we deal with the layers of craft that we accumulate, as whatever kind of craftsman you are, a wordsmith or a dancer or a writer or a communicator of sorts. There's layers of craft that's always present, and quite often it makes something opaque in the way you relate to people. You know, there's a certain opacity that comes into how you confront people. And what do you do with what you know? Can you park it aside? Can you allow what is relevant to kind of seep in and aid and abet the real questions that are dying to be asked? So these are concerns that are constantly there. And within the scope of the jumping project, the idea was to work with the largest cross-section of people I knew who would not necessarily be dancers or performers at all. So there were people from sport, there were people from law, there were technical people, all of them engaged in just one main physicality, which is jumping, common to different age groups, different disciplines, performative and non-performative. And we structured a 45-minute, high-octane, extremely exhausting work in which, well, jumping doesn't really allow you to be pretty or beautiful, no? By the way. It's just so exhausting that whatever it is what comes out. And that was one of the ways of addressing that. There was also, everybody had to memorize these scores, which they had to remember throughout, and the effort of keeping that in mind, because you could actually enjoy yourself if you didn't. So these two things, and the fact that it was visible from all sides and there was no entry or exit, and and people from the age group of 25 to 55 were in it. So the levels of exhaustion were also very apparent. And somewhere, I think, through that, there was something kind of vulnerable about the body that comes out, something that's not decorated. It was not about how efficiently you jumped. It was not about how high or how perfect, and you could be at sometimes, but over the course of 45 minutes, either your memory gives way or your body gives way. And, to see those cracks, it was a very deliberate dramaturgy in the work. And it kind of, the closest I can come to talking about that is, when you say in your article, why poetry, you say words are a means of making ourselves vulnerable, frequently to each other, but also to ourselves. For far too long, we've used them as weapons, as armors, as territorial markers. And with every verbal parry and thrust, with every dogmatic full stop, we move further away from the possibility of opening ourselves to growth, to surprise, to the startling confrontation of self with self. I found that such a close sort of an articulation with what I was trying to do with the body.
I'm glad you picked that out. I mean, I haven't looked at that piece in a very long time. It's an essay I wrote many years ago.
Yeah.
But yes, I'm glad you chose those lines, because it's precisely that makes me made me ask you the question. I feel often with me, and I suspect this is true for many artists, that one realizes after one has inhabited a form and worked with it for a very long time, one realizes that one can't go back, and nor does one necessarily want to unconsciousness, whether it's being an unconscious inhabitant of the body or whether it's unconsciously engaging in any kind of utterance, which is poetry. You might think it's poetry. For many of us, I don't know if you did this, but many of us growing up, one wrote reams in a journal and unburdened oneself and transcribed every minute fluctuation in one stream of consciousness on the page. And that was a wonderfully, deeply transformative exercise. But do I want to go back to that level of, a journal still has its place, but do I want to necessarily share my journal with the next person? No. There is a kind of unconsciousness about that exercise. So for me, there is a mistrust of putting that sort of entry into the world. On the other hand, there is the other extreme, which is this form of mannered, highly precious, self-conscious way of being as an artist, and which can permeate the work in all sorts of ways. It can be mannered, it can be, it's the virtuoso flaunting her thing. And that's something that, in fact, makes me very uncomfortable as well. So my journey or my constant attempt to rejuvenate this understanding for myself has really been, how do you walk a path that is not unconscious and not self-conscious? Is there a way to be conscious in my utterance? Is there a way to be, I'm not interested in being an innocent again, and nor am I interested in being a virtuoso, but I am interested in, I suppose, what which is called in our own traditions all over in this country, but I haven't found a real equivalent for that, which is a kind of sahaj quality, a naturalness, but an informed naturalness. So you reach a point of poise, but there is no tension in the poise. There is no grit-toothed penance showing through in the poise. That poise has now become part of who you are because you've trusted, you've spent long enough with your form to be able to trust it to some degree. And you're not trying to conquer it and micromanage it, but you're trying, I mean, this for me has been my quest, I'd say,
Right.
The one that resonates with what you point out right now.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So I also want to ask you this, because very closely related to this idea of honesty is the fact that I imagine, just like I was talking about utterance as language, your language, the language of the body, is conditioned in so many ways that the very act of deconditioning is, of course, the journey of a lifetime, and one's probably never through with that even then. But you talk very interestingly, the word you used, which I read somewhere, the word you used was anesthetization. And you talked about the ways in which the body has been anesthetized, and the word stayed with me. And I want you to talk a little about what are the different kinds of anesthesia to which the body is subject.
Yeah. So I think for me, this idea of we take in a whole lot of experiences into the body, and our relationship with the world is very much recorded in the way we carry ourselves. In addition to what we articulate, but very much in how we look, how we sit, how we stand, how we make ourselves known.
Yeah.
And somehow I felt the job of dance was to somehow release the body from this kind of manicured way of being, And more specifically, it became a technique, more or less, in one of the works called Sweet Sorrow. It was way back in 2010, which was looking at the larger universal themes of loss and longing interspersed with more personal sort of experiences of loss. And the roots of that project had to do with being inspired by an artist from France called Sophie Calle. And she had written a book called Douleur Exquise, Exquisite Pain, I think, which happened to find its way to my home once. And this book was interesting because it had, if you open it, it's like a photo journal. So there are images of people and first-person narratives of their answer to a question that the author has posed to them. When was which you suffered the most? I think this was the question. And the history of that is, so the author, Sophie Calle, gets dumped by her boyfriend at some point. And in the 92 days that follow this incident, she is on a trans-Siberian train journey where she kind of interviews everybody she meets, asking them for their accounts of when they suffered the most. And somewhere interspersed between all that is the lead up. It's like a countdown to the moment when her boyfriend said, well, I've met someone else and it's over. So in the retelling of the pain of other people's pain, there's little by little her own memory is stirred, and little by little it's forgotten and cauterized almost, And this was actually a very interesting sort of a placement and a technique that I transposed on to another process of talking about the self. And I just found that a lot of the time within my experience of the classical practice, there was this huge preoccupation with beauty, with how beautifully sorrow is expressed, how beautifully suffering is expressed, and somehow the beautiful gets underlined so much. So the question was, can there be something that's comical about sorrow? Can there be something that's absolutely ugly or laughable, or that it attacks you in a moment when you're unprepared for it? So this kind of juxtaposition is what became interesting, and this was one of the ways that this idea of anesthetization got absorbed into the work. But by and large, when I speak about the anesthetized body, I'm referring to the multiple ways in which being a woman, being Indian, being a dancer imposes so much of baggage, so much of expectation, that whatever it is that is real and sort of alive has to sort of pass through and navigate all these various areas before it comes out. And I refer to that, as a kind of an anesthetization. Yeah.
So you felt that the actual training in these forms, you've learned Bharatanatyam, you went to London, you were part of the Laban, you were there, you came back from the Laban school, you worked here. Are you saying the very training in these forms in itself was in some way part of the conditioning that you later had to work against?
Not quite, not quite. I think the learning was fantastically open. I think the structures are endlessly generative. And I think they're open to 100 interpretations of every kind. And I think people are doing fascinating work within it. I think I refer to what is personally a bit of a mismatch, simply because life and art did not meet at a certain point. The aesthetic of form did not sit very comfortably with the experience of the body outside of the performance space. And this became a point of contention, which then leads you to look at people who have dealt with grammar, people who have dealt with the abstraction of the form, going down to the essence of it. And with a history, as there is in Chennai, of this kind of work through many people. There's Chandradekha, there is Padmini, with whom I actually returned. I did my master's in London. And looking at the scene, I somehow felt that if I was to continue working as a dancer there, I would be nothing more than the exotic other. This was a feeling I got very strongly, and by which time I had actually experienced something of a very strong push for redefining the Indian body back home here, with all the experiments that were happening. And I chose to return simply to push at this forefront a little bit more, So I think this is what is interesting, because there is a way in which we write ourselves into history in a way that it's impossible to escape. If technique, or if training, or if legacy is used as some sort of a shield, then it doesn't really allow you to go forward in any real sense, and you need a certain deconstruction to happen at every point, to question relevance at every point, and to, have a certain ease with which you can break down that which has also been built, and repropose something.
Yeah, but I've always felt that, as performing artists, particularly theater, my friends in theater and dance, I've always wondered at how they negotiate this part of it, because the presentation of self is really at the forefront and again in performance, and that can become all the paraphernalia that goes with it, the decorativeness, all of that's built into it. How to start unpeeling that is, I imagine,
Yeah,
a challenging journey.
it sure is. It really is, and somewhere it's also what you say, about. I'm going to read one of the lines I love from your poem. Um, the world takes a breath, knowing that as long as there are lists, the world is safe, and meaning won't save us, never has, but rhythms will. I kind of sort of want to bring that up at this juncture, because it's always it's a question of what is essentially there, which is sort of wrapped up in these layers of meaning, in these layers of symbolism, in these layers of things that actually move away from the actual experience of something that's going on, and potentially sort of cloud what you could receive, in multiple ways.
Absolutely. In fact, if anything, I've begun to, for a while I've said this, but I experienced it most intensely in this period. I've said for a while that one of the reasons I'm drawn to poetry is that it's also a form that offers you a reprieve from meaning. Not just about, yes, words have their own charge and their own semantic histories, but what poetry also offers you is rhythm and pause and music, and all of that is a wonderful reprieve from the cargo of meaning that we are always being bombarded by.
Absolutely.
That's been in many ways my long-standing negotiation against one, just rising decibel levels, which we are surrounded by mainstream media, social media, conversations, opinions, that whole clamor that's going on.
Yeah,
And the
yeah.
other part of it is what always bothers me, which is tone. So there's noise on the one hand, and there is tone. The fact that we are almost collectively being encouraged to adopt a tone of certainty about everything, whether it's in religion, whether it's in politics, whether it's in culture, irrespective of what persuasion ours is. I've found that kind of tiresomeness of the full stop. I find it deeply fatiguing. So for me, poetry has been also a chance to attempt to reclaim the power of the comma, the power of the question mark. And it's not easy, because I completely understand this when, especially younger people at workshops, when one has conversations with them, there is a very strong sense of how do I counter something without being, emphatic about my countering of it. And it takes time to see, and I'm not saying I've mastered it at all, but this is an attempt, and this is what I try to remind them of, that sometimes the way to outshout, um, the way to be heard is not to outshout.
Absolutely.
It can sometimes be to just drop your voice. The way to be heard can sometimes be to hang on doggedly to question mark. And I believe, or I like to believe, try to keep the faith that in some small way that makes a difference. So for so many years, Preethi, I thought I was looking for the meaning of life. Actually struck me that I wasn't. I was looking for a more intense, alive, I was looking for a more heightened experience of life itself.
Yeah.
It took me time to realize that. And when I did, I realized that was happening for me through the arts to some degree, but it wasn't enough. And that led me on other journeys too. But it's interesting to have this particular conversation. I'm going to share a poem with you, if you don't mind, not the one that you're alluding to.
Please.
But a poem that was actually sent today to it was done a couple of days ago, but sent today to a publication. And I wanted to read it to you because we are discussing, as I see it, or we are going to be deepening that discussion, of a sense of betweenness. And that to me comes through very strongly in the work that you've just created and the work that we're about to see. So I'd like to lead into that work by perhaps reading this poem for you. This is a reading dedicated to you, Preethi. It's my way of trying to process this time of great inner churning. So it's almost a note to myself. And it's called Stay Unnamed. This is the vegetal hour. Time to listen like a plant, learning to combust into an origami of green watchfulness, remembering there will be time for leaves to turn into a million emerald parrots in a lather of cloud, but not yet. This is the time for roots, the stolid, weather-beaten innocence of roots. This is the time to stay unnamed. This is the octopus hour, time to attend to that ancient mollusk, the heart, parentless, shellless, learning to live without armor, without ancestry, not wetly curious, not expanding, not just yet, into a wild federation of tentacles. This is the time to stay unnamed. And I think with that, it would be nice to move into your film. Should we move
That was so beautiful. Thank you. That was really beautiful.
forward to the film? I think this is a segue, a possible segue. Thank you. Thank you for that, Preethi.
You're welcome.
Um, good to pause for a moment to move from that medium to conversation again.
Yeah, it's always a thing to watch one's own work.
Is it difficult?
Well, it always seems you see something afresh, you see something differently, and that's the thing with looking at it again. But I may as well take the opportunity to say that it was filmed by Sharon Devkar Shankar, who's a young and beautiful photographer and filmmaker based out of Chennai. And this was a renovation site that was facilitated by the Prakriti Foundation that invited me to simply walk through, and this was fairly early into lockdown.
I see.
And the invitation came fairly early into lockdown, and it was several months later, in fact, the end of July, when I sort of dared to go, but it was very much a response to a site that was sort of unfinished work, hanging in the air, um, human activity all around, but nobody present, slippers, bottles, wires, everything kind of hinting at people who've just inhabited the space before, and everything sort of, in a place of in-betweenness, you know.
Precisely the word that I wrote when I saw this film a week and a half ago. There were two things I wrote. One of them was in between, betweenness. And because you're a dancer and I wanted to allow you a verb, I wrote betweening. But betweening was the feeling I had, the in-betweenness of the space, the unfinished, jagged, rough, makeshift sense of your own movement, nothing immaculate there, also an in-between. And of course, the in-betweenness of the times we're in, where we really don't know where we are heading, and we really don't know where we are even. It's been a time to stay unnamed. And that's been the challenge, I think. The other
Totally.
thing that I wrote, I must say, in between this, betweening was one that I wrote. The other thing that I wrote was kinetic doodling, because doodling is something I do a fair amount of. I've done it since college, when one was endlessly doodling in class when lectures were, insufferable. Doodling, and especially in the margins of books, and always wishing for a time when margin and main text could somehow come together, but never quite knowing how. But there is an element of ease in doodling and of playfulness. And that's something that struck me as well about your piece. Whether it's just the way in which you're grinding pebbles underfoot, or whether it's the ways in which you're testing, pushing, testing, playing with ideas of precariousness. Um, there is that quality of doodling. Would you agree?
Yeah. I mean, I love this phrase, kinetic doodling. I'm going to keep it. I'm going to steal it, and I'm going to keep it. I think it's very much describes the process that I'm engaged in even now, several months after this film project. Why doodling seems apt to describe this kind of search is simply, if you think about it, it's what is doodling? I mean, it's a drawing made when your attention is otherwise occupied, that it could be a mediator between overthinking something or thinking too little, and it sort of helps focus on the current situation, and it's precisely this about doodling that's so sort of spot on right now. And if you think about the lockdown, in the early days of lockdown, March, I mean, it was something that nobody was prepared for. I mean, there was enormous distrust of everything around you, every surface, I mean, we couldn't look at our own hands without thinking, how many times have you washed it? Do you touch, do you not touch, mask, and constantly be reminded by the media about how your indiscipline is causing death all around, and so this kind of distrust of your bodily self is something I think, performer or non-performer, it was a very, very palpable sort of a sense, where have I leaned, where have I sat, whom have I touched, Where have I coughed, So it's a sense of alienation that kind of overcomes the self and went against the grain of everything that dance has taught me to do and be, even just be, the sort of relationship with surface, with people, with weight, with, using all the faculties to sort of make a connection rather than to sort of constantly isolate and, pull yourself into this little hole. So when I went to this renovation site, it was very much a mediation between the material things that were there, the cement, the pebbles, the rocks, the scaffolding, and when we started working, it was very much under the assumption that we are not making a dance film, but we're making a film about the space, and perhaps moving through it can activate something in the space because I recently read this author, Paul Basu. He's written this book called The In-Betweenness of Things. And the way he says it is that the in-between provides a way to escape the relentless search for the singular and true nature of things, the desire for certainty, for dividing the world into this or that. In-betweenness is a state of multiplicity, an understanding of the material world as being constituted by movement and mediation. It was very much this thing that was intuitively what was going on for me. It was not really to dance through the space, but to actually move, to not use the space, or to it also had a way of deciding how you had to be there. There were so many doorways, so many rectangles and squares, and which made the perceiver, the camera, also very, very present in how it's framing the whole film. And somewhere in betweenness became sort of metamorphosed into this whole coming together of the stillness of the space. It seemed like it had been abandoned for quite a while, but in a rush. So there were things unfinished, even boxes, different boxes and things we found, water bottles half drunk, bits of reading, personal belongings, dhotis and things around. And, yeah, it was incredibly telltale in so many ways in this kind of pause, in this moment of pause. And the doodling became something of a technique, if you like, a kind of a process, if you like, of meandering through the space without really needing to fix an idea of this is how the dance is dealing with this space, this is how the architecture is going to be defined, or thinking of space also as something which is defined by what it witnesses rather than just the structure of its walls or the perspective a camera affords. It's also what it's coming into contact with. And so these many things were very much in the balance. Yes.
Yeah. I think betweenness has been something that almost everyone is going to be able to respond to at this point. One is, the image that has kept me, that I've hung on to, but which hasn't always offered consolation, has been the image of two images. One is of caterpillar and butterfly, and being that kind of organic broth in between, with no certainty that one is going to emerge into some kind of winged being, that one may never be terrestrial or aerial, one could just be soup. And the other image that has actually been one of in-betweenness for me has been not looking at, the notion of the Amrit Manthan, where you're not, especially coming back to what you said about the either or. This is something that I've found myself deeply troubled by, the ways in which we are forced into these either or situations, even in the way we speak, and trying to find the third way through that always has been the quest. Poetry offers a possible path for me, but one is still trying. So the idea that one is not a deva or an asura, one is not a good guy or a bad guy. At this point, one is just the churning, nothing but the churning. with no guarantee again that there's going to be a God who will hold you in his throat, trying to hold on to some idea of this has happened before. Mythology prepares you for it in some way, but you know how one claws sometimes on walls, trying to hold on to something that will nourish and sustain through these times. So I think the pause can be a time of great terror, and the pause can also be a time of possibility. And I've certainly experienced both. Disquiet, if not terror, disquiet and sadness, deep sadness, but also moments of great, the smell of freedom as well, you know, both. And that's going to lead me, Preethi, to something that I wanted to ask you, which, because this again is very much something I would grapple with, I want to ask you about the way in which your piece works with the idea of time. You know, we just have a question that's come up here about the notion of space. This is a questioner who wants to know how you work with space. We'll come to that because it's her question. In a way, you've already touched on it, but we'll come to that a little later. I want to start at this point. I want to at least move on to time, because your very title, the very title of your piece is, and indeed there will be time, which is that lovely line from the love song of the Alfred Prufrock, the T.S. Eliot poem. It's a poem that's mattered to me and very early in my life, and then has continued to matter at different times for different reasons. But I'll talk about the ways in which time plagues me or haunts me, because I do believe that lyric poets are often haunted by time. I'll talk about that, but I want to know from you, there are two things that struck me about the way in which you use time. One is the unhurried, relaxed quality of this piece, which was striking. That came through to me right away. The other quality that struck me was the playfulness, and therefore the lack of performance anxiety. And that playfulness is there in the very title. So, you know, there's a sense of stretching and allowing rather than doing. So I want you to just expand on that if you can.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, and indeed, there will be time to wonder, do I dare disturb the universe? In a minute, there is time for decisions and revisions, which a minute will reverse. From the love song of Alfred Prufrock. Of course, the title came at the end of the process, but in the deliberations over the space, the walkthroughs, and in the sensing of the space in a way, I think time has always been a very subjective notion, especially to capture in any sense, the sense of an image, in the sense of a photograph, a film, a poem, a song. I think it is something that lends itself to multiple interpretations, and I feel that the dealing with slowness especially is also a certain inheritance for me, that the slowness actually allows the interstices of a thing to become visible, allows intentionality to become visible, and it's never just one thing, it's always such a complex, multiple layered thing, intention, you know, and what happens when you watch something that's sort of deconstructed so slowly and so deliberately, you know, it's almost impossible to find the syntax, or, you know, you read the syntax very differently, you read the grammar very differently, and therefore the lexicon is new again, you know, the words are new. You're not looking at them for a certain conception that you have in your mind about a body, about a space, about what a film does to you. You know, of course, we all expect a lot from film because the media is constantly shoving images in your face, and they're moving at a speed that is impossible to digest. You know, it's impossible to digest all the things that are coming through television, through the internet, through social media. It's way, you know, in excess of what we can actually hold on to. So I think this idea of looking at time as a sort of a stretched, lived moment, which is not in a hurry to dress itself up into any sort of a point making. I think this is a certain preoccupation that has emerged for me, even in the process I'm engaged in at the moment, or I'm working alone by myself. But this has very much been a quest to find the impulse, and how long does an impulse stay with you? You know, how many forms does it take, and how does it play out each day? And it's impossible to fix what it is. Of course, you can come to a certain average, but then I like the fact that it moves within the spectrum of the average. It's always kind of, you know, moving back and forth and offering so many different possibilities and potentialities. And I think that's what I enjoy the most about this moment in time, that for once perhaps we are able to rewrite that which we are, not entirely governed by the forces of the market, not entirely governed by the externality of things as we normally are. You know, you normally, it feels like you're running up a sliding slope, and you know, the faster you run, the more the slope is descending. So this idea of pause has actually been a moment to find so many sort of multiple layers in which you do exist, and to embrace them for what they are, and to really see the potential of it. You know, who says a writer writes and a dancer dances, or a thinker thinks? You know, it's we all exist at so many levels, and it's been a moment to find all of that simply by, you know, closing and opening different boxes, perhaps.
Yeah, it's interesting that we think about, or sometimes talk about thinking out of the box, when in fact on Zoom we are all reduced to these boxes. And I want to know what it means to you as a dancer, really, Preethi, because from what I learned from other fellow artists, particularly performing artists, where the liveness of their form has been so deeply impacted by this time. What has it meant to be reduced to this box and then to think out of it in all sorts of ways?
I must say that I have not engaged a whole lot with Zoom. I have not really tried to enter into the space of live streamed performances. I find I'm not able to really deal with the two-dimensionality of it, and I feel that the live experience is not meant to be substituted for what seems to be happening in a rush right now. I think there is much more to be gained from a live interaction, and I am willing to wait for my desire to really build up a little bit more. And of course, a film is one medium. This film came at an invitation, and it was a interim something. But I don't believe that we can completely change the nature of live performance for this kind of digital experience. I don't entirely believe it. I think there are several beautiful things that can happen within this space. And there are several people doing very, very interesting interventional kind of work within it. But for me personally, with movement and with the immediacy of what live performance does, I am willing to wait and find it again.
It's good to know. I'm going to say something. I'm going to just respond. I'm sorry, Preethi. I'm just assuming that you want to hear a response. But
I do.
About time. Because I think there's really no way to talk about poetry without, especially if you're not writing necessarily the narrative verse, but the lyric poem. The lyric poem is a very, very specific, very singular collaboration with time. And to me, what has always fascinated me about it is the fact that it's an invitation to inhabit this here and now so intensely that it doesn't allow you to escape the way, for instance, fiction does. It's a wonderful escape. I'm not demeaning fiction at all, but it's a wonderful escape. It can be a wonderful escape into a horizontal time from beginning to middle to end. Whereas the lyric poem is and it's an invitation, and sometimes it's almost an imperative to inhabit the here and now. But what you begin to realize as you spend time with it, reading it or practicing it, is that the here and now becomes, which is a vertical engagement with this moment, with time, it becomes a way to effortlessly move into something much larger, which we might, for want of a better word, call universal. But you're not aching for universality. You're not trying desperately to talk about absolutes and infinity, and to talk about infinity and the cosmos. You're not trying any of that. You're just inhabiting this moment, in this time, this place, deeply. That's the logic and that's the guile of a lyric poem. And the other thing that interests me particularly about time, and this goes back to what we started talking about when we spoke of the honest body. For me, the honest utterance, as I said, there's been a long-standing tension in the lyric poem as well between innocence and experience. Experience happens over time. Innocence is often the state that we eulogize when we're talking about youth, childhood. And I find myself less interested in that wonderful kitten-eyed gaze of childhood, which is lovely and it's seductive and beautiful to watch. But in my most recent book, Love Without a Story, I find myself fascinated by the figure of the old woman, the crone, and what that represents. What is her gaze? And for me, the crone in this particular book is Avvaiyar, the great Tamil poet, wanderer, wise woman. And I try to understand what it is that she has been able to reclaim for herself at the end of this journey. And I believe there is a kind of innocence there, but it is no longer naivete. I call it the ability to see through the game, but still smile at those who play it. And the last line of the poem actually addresses a question that's just come up. The question has asked us to talk about poise and talk about rhythm. I'm going to hand that over to you. But before I do that, I want to quote you the last line of the poem because in many ways it's linked to time again. I think of Avvaiyar as this woman who's unhurried, forever out of step, always on time. And that in many ways, as I often say, is my aspiration. That's the person I want to be. So with that, I'm going to ask you to maybe share a few very quick thoughts about, would you like to say something about poise and rhythm? Because I think we may need to start winding down, but I'm going to check if there are other questions coming up. But
okay. About poise and rhythm.
Daita, I think Nere, she says that she found two ideas coming up. She's a dancer and choreographer, and she says she's thinking a great deal about poise and rhythm. I think I touched on that in when I was talking earlier about poise without tension, and now in my idea of rhythm in the way Avvaiyar walks. That's the walk I want. Unhurried, forever out of step, always on time. Tell me about your idea of poise and rhythm.
Well, I think rhythm is something that has to come from intention, and intentionality is played when you are able to listen to the body and you're able to decide what is the definitive moment to move and therefore how, rather than it being an external compositional. Of course, the compositional side of things is important, but I do believe that it has to happen from within, and I would attribute rhythm to that. And poise actually comes from within that sense of knowing yourself in that moment in time, feeling that present moment very strongly, and to have a very, very clear engagement with the material that's around you, including the air that you're breathing, the sounds you're hearing, and that is very much where I place the importance of poise and rhythm.
Yes. I wonder if there's something you'd also like to say about context, because that was the first question from Ana Sanchez, who wanted to know about space. Is there anything you'd like to add to what you've already said?
Well, pretty much where we started with the space itself, pretty much where we started with sort of looking at the stillness and the emptiness of the space, but it was not an emptiness that was entirely empty. It had so much hanging in the air, and the what could be a way to capture this kind of emptiness, what could be a way to capture this stillness, which is still so replete with the rhythms of having lived, worked. It was a home and it's now a renovation site, and you can actually sense the multiple bodies that have been there. And what is the way to be still? What is the way for my body to activate a certain passage or a certain squareness or a depth of focus? What can I draw the eye to in terms of a sound? It was close to the airport. So, all of these things kind of make up what you notice of a space, and the decision, therefore, on how to bring that space alive. Of course, Anna would ask me that simply because we did study a lot together 20 years ago about space being a visible aspect of the moving body. You can watch, either you can watch a person move from point A to point B, or you can watch what happens to the space as they move from point A to point B. And I would say thank you to her because I still remember that.
Perhaps the notion of time is the right one to be invoking at the very end of our conversation again, but I've just found this message saying that it's time for us to start winding down. Is there anything that you'd like to add or ask, Preethi, before we start, before we thank our organizers, BIC as well as Prakriti?
No, I think this has been a really, really beautiful, short but deep sort of a conversation, which triggers up many questions for me. But I think we will take it up again with each other at another point in time. I'm just interested in how we're going to take these trajectories forward, and how we're able to actually reach out to an audience, and how the scene is going to change over this time, because we certainly can't go back to something. It's only a going forward. And so all of these conversations are actually incredibly important in informing this going forward. So I'm going to leave with that thought. But thank you, Arundhati, and thank you, Prakriti Foundation and Bangalore International Center, and all of you who've been here with us. Thank you.
Yes, thank you all. I just want to say from my end that there's a relaxed, unhurried quality to this conversation as well, which has mattered. So I do look forward to that continuing. Thanks, Preethi.
Thank you.
Who else but a poet to tease out the deepest articulation of a dancer, and vice versa? Thank you for allowing us to intrude on a mover's mind space, Preethi, with this sharing and frankly revealing conversation. Arundhati, your incisive observations, almost like a spiritual mediation with the mind of an artist, has afforded us a moment to grapple with the situation with the music of your words. Thank you, both of you, for coming together for this wonderful, beautiful, rich conversation. Thank you, Prakriti Foundation and Meera, for making this collaboration happen. Thank you, audiences, for joining us this evening.
Thanks, Lekha.
Thank you, Lekha.
Bye. Lekha, all of you. Bye.
Bye.